Thank you and welcome for joining us today um, for this book talk on law, migration, and precarious labor by Anastasia Tataryn. And this book talk series came out of a call from our members to share with them books that were grounded in GRN's vision and mission. So when I introduce different titles, I'm really bringing them from that desire, that need that you asked to share books that you could introduce into your classroom or into your literature reviews. And we hope these titles enrich your syllabi and your research. And today we're presenting Law, Migration, and Precarious Labor because it, one, interrogates and challenges the categories and frameworks that embody legal structures and migration discourses, and examine the deeper crisis of politics, economics, and law. And it provides a nuanced and interdisciplinary frame to understand the world. With that, I would like to introduce today's author. Dr. Anastasia Tataryn is a faculty member of St. Jerome's University at the University of Waterloo in Canada since 2020. She was a lecturer in law at the University of Liverpool from 2015 to 2020 and previously held positions at the School of Law, Birkbeck College, University of London, at the Warwick Law School, University of Warwick in the UK. Anastasia's interest in law and legal studies starts from questions of how law and its limits are constructed. Her research interrogates the limits of legal frameworks by deeply questioning the foundations and categories of modern law and legal subjectivity. She does this primarily through studies of labor employment law, immigration law and national citizenship, and social uprising and resistance movements. Anastasia's research draws from decoloniality, anarchist thought, feminist theories, indigenous research methodologies, and post-structuralist approaches to law. She holds a PhD in law from the School of Law, Birkbeck College, University of London, UK. Her LLM was completed in Osgoode Hall Law School in Toronto, Canada. Additionally, Anastasia holds an MA in History from York University, Canada, and a Bachelor from the University of Saskatchewan. And with that, I'll ask the first question.
Possible to speak about migration and immigration without also looking at labor and work and how the economy and labor markets had such a strong role to play in what was happening as people were crossing territorial borders. So I kind of, at a certain point in my PhD, I thought, okay, I'm no longer doing a PhD in immigration law or migration law per se. I'm now kind of bridging over to labor law and employment law, but then it's not solely about labor and employment either, because there are huge themes that are undeniable, even if one wanted to just look at what happens in a domestic employment context these days, and I'm saying that generously because it's now, a few decades, but that is so intricately connected with what's happening with the global movement of persons and goods across borders. So essentially the project began as a question and a frustrated, impatient question of why is there still so many people that are stuck in the gaps of legal frameworks and legal categories? And why is it that immigration law and policy, labor law and policy, human rights law and policy and discourse are unable to actually address or seemingly kind of grapple with these gray zones and these people, actual human beings that are stuck in the gaps of law?
And I think really this, for me, this was the excitement of the book. I think this really came through, and is why I got excited about it, because I could see the author grappling with these very complex issues. And I think it was very exciting for me because I'm kind of I'm trying to think and thinking about the same thing. I studied international development, And it just seemed that these problems never went away. And no one really was addressing what are the core issues that are driving people to move.
Mm.
So, I mean, that came across just very well in the book. And especially, since there are so many, like you said, moving parts to what you're talking about, I really appreciated how you continually brought the reader back and kind of reintroduced the ideas, not in a redundant way, but in a way that kind of just was building and reinforcing. And it kind of, links to the next question that I'm going to ask, because you do bring in um, multiple ideas, but
Mm.
it needs to happen because we're not one dimensional. Humans aren't one dimensional. We have multiple things happening. So you have to view not only just what's happening in that person's life, but also, as you mentioned, the law and the social structures. So my second question is, how do these historical contexts, past, present empire, colonialism, neoliberalism, hierarchies of belonging, inform the migration crisis that you address in your book?
Yeah, that's a whole other book in and of itself. But it's a great question. And
If
I
you're just
just
gonna briefly outline for everybody, kind of, why you brought that in, how you felt it was important, and kind of what are the main streams of ideas that flowed into your book.
yeah, absolutely. And I was just gonna, before I answer that, just to say about this kind of bringing in different ideas. I think that I thank you for saying that, actually, because I think part of what I realized in moving from a PhD to then kind of writing a book, and changing it quite significantly, I would say, is that it's impossible to ask these big questions, and these kind of underlying fundamental questions while staying rooted in a particularly defined field, or even discipline. And so there is something that's inevitably kind of uncomfortable, even for publishers, when it's not clearly marked as a book that fits into this particular specific field or conversation or whatnot. But it's kind of goes with the territory if you're actually motivated and like compelled by a question that causes you to keep digging and keep making these connections. So yes, so in terms of so historical context, past and present empire, colonialism, neoliberalism, hierarchies of belonging as linking to the migration crisis, for me, and I guess for what I wanted to kind of start the book with and kind of base it in, is to really start with the acknowledgement, or the scene as it is, that means that we cannot look at the migration crisis, or in another kind of aspect of the book, the kind of crisis in employment or crisis with precarious work. We can't look at that as being something that is a new phenomenon, something that is, a 21st century creation, or B, something that is just about one particular demographic moving from point A to point B because of a relatively current occasion. So in other words, migration crisis, if we're looking at it in the context of the book, I look primarily at immigration into Europe and labor in Europe and the UK. So if we're looking at migration crisis as being predominantly the movement of persons from North Africa across the Mediterranean into Europe. So that was kind of what was the most in the news and in the media when I was writing this book. That can be seen as something that is connected to the war in Syria or war in Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, so very quickly people say, oh, that's caused by this particular event in this particular country that's causing those particular people to flee and then to search for a home elsewhere. The historical context, however, and again, going back to how I thought was vital to start the questions that the book addresses, is to say, okay, first of all, it is impossible to say or to limit our analysis to this is just because of the war in Syria, or this is just because of American intervention in the Middle East, even. Because of the roots and the ongoing relationships of colonial domination, of imperialism, of resource extraction that have now caused these kind of sites of violence, war, environmental catastrophe, that tend to kind of blow up at certain times and then cause particular demographics to migrate. But in order to see migration crisis as something, and this I know goes into the next question that you have for me, but in order to see these crises as actually something that is not a singular event in terms of the word crisis that is just happening now that we have to address and then it'll pass, that these are actually kind of the state of the world for the past 500 plus years. And I know many scholars, especially recently, I think there's more of an acknowledgement that we need to see the kind of current state of politics and law, governance, even our kind of Western epistemology, as being something that is rooted in the colonial project that began around 500 years ago, but is still very much continuing and has not been seriously addressed or reckoned with. And so everything that we are now experiencing in terms of these pockets or these occasions, these crises, actually have their roots in this colonial expansion that again can't be linked just to one country in particular, but it is a European project, or colonialism. And it's since that colonial project that is linked to Enlightenment thought, that is then linked to the development and the kind of expansion of capitalist, globalized resource extraction and modes of exchange and modes of production. That is what we need to kind of bring into the context in order to understand why nothing is changing. Because unless we actually grapple and reckon with that colonial history and that specificity of that colonial project, empirical or empire, project of empire, then we won't ever be able to actually stop this reproduction of colonialism that has now become a reproduction of neoliberalism, processes of neoliberalization. And then, as you say in the question too, these hierarchies of belonging, I think is a great way of also making that link between ongoing colonialism, neoliberalism, with then the hierarchies of belonging that we see within the structure of the nation state today. So not only in terms of access to citizenship and the kind of discussions around what citizenship means, or even status, even having legal immigration status, but also the kind of hierarchies that we see within citizenship. So obviously, like I'm thinking now, because I'm based in Canada, I am thinking about the States and Black Lives Matter and everything that is coming through in terms of seeing people who have legal status, technically speaking, as people born and raised in a particular country. And yet the structures, the hierarchies of belonging are such that people are experiencing that same violence that is colonialism, that is neoliberalism, that is all of these interconnected pieces. They're still experiencing that in spite of holding legal status and citizenship. Does that answer the question? Does that make sense? I mean,
it does. And
yeah.
I think one of the things that you do is you name it. You name what it is, and what we've done through the different book talk. Your book is like the culmination of the different theories and ideas that each author was talking about. Where Karen and de Molinaire were talking about how research is done and is reproducing these systems of violence in people in the global south and people who are don't have a lot of resources, and researchers come in and exploit them. And then we had Anna Singh with the Feral Atlas, kind of complicating that picture and populating it with these different, human and non-human entities with the Feral Atlas, and then Julian Go bringing this overarching theoretical lens to talk about this post-colonialism and social theory. And your book kind of brought us back into, for lack of better words, the real world, and how do all of these things play out in our everyday lives? How does law connect that with how whether it's the migration crisis or labor crisis or all of these crises that we see happening, um, to discuss how that 500 years has brought us to this point. If anyone was paying attention, it could have only have gone this way. This
Yeah.
is the next question of
Yeah.
this kind of idea of normalizing
Mm.
this type of always being in a crisis mode, looking towards the next crisis. Now where we're heading into kind of the crisis of climate change
Yeah.
and what that is going to bring. So how do you situate this idea of what you call a new normal within again those contexts of history?
Um, yes, yeah, thank you. I mean, that's very that's very kind of you actually to draw that out of the book. I feel very like, wow, thank you for saying that. Because I think my goal was always to make sure that my writing returned us back to what's happening on the ground. And so I'm glad that came across. Um, and so in terms of, yeah, this new normal, so there's two parts, I think, to this, to my answer to your question, I guess, and to how I see this new normal. On the one hand, I do think that we are absolutely living through and experiencing an even heightened normalization of crisis, not even with environment, but with COVID, I would say. So this capacity, this incredible kind of resilience and tenacity of the what can be called the colonial matrix of power, which now I'm referencing Annabelle Quijano's work, which I talk about in the last chapter of the book, but currently my work is kind of trying to draw that out more. So this colonial matrix of power that I think is this culmination of, or this joining of capitalism, colonialism, and actually patriarchy, and these kind of hegemonic forces. This normalization and this resilience of that framework, this matrix, to just continue us society, the kind of the idea of the global, what we are doing in this world, it just rolls over from seeming catastrophe to next seeming catastrophe. And at every point, especially with climate change and with COVID now, it seems as if things are going to have to change. And so many people say that in the news, in academia, in various discussions, people say, surely this is the time that we're going to wake up. And yet it just rolls over and continues. But with, I think, especially now with the kind of attention to mental health and what this is doing to our interpersonal relationships, we're seeing more and more that we may be continuing in some way, but we are also experiencing a complete and utter overdrive and kind of reaching maximum capacity of our ability to exist in this new normal of crisis, and in this kind of normalized state of complete craziness, essentially. And it's a craziness that is linked to this compulsion of capitalist accumulation, this compulsion of seeing the kind of Western hegemonic kind of modernity as being the only way to survive, the only way to diagnose challenges, the only way to understand problems like migration. And this, yeah, so it's kind of this overdrive now, but at the same time, it's absolutely normalized because we continue, and this is our discourse, this is our vocabulary, this is our governance structure, this is our legal structure. This is kind of seemingly totalized, and I'll get to that seemingly totalized in a bit. So I think that normalization of crisis is the first kind of answer to that, how I frame the new normal. And then it's absolutely a normalization of the particular historical context that I said 500 years, but it's more than 500. So it's a lack of really that reckoning that I spoke about earlier that is a new normal. But then on the other hand, a bit more specifically, what I identify as being a new normal in the context of precarious labor and migration is that there is a new normal whereby certain people, certain bodies, certain beings have to break the law or have to exist either against the law or in the shadow of the law in order to survive. So that is also something that has become normalized. So the irregular that I talk about in the context of irregular migrants and people who are working in situations of irregular status in immigration and in work, the irregular has become regular because now we have situations. Again, I focus mostly on the UK, but this I think is seen across the world. We have situations where not only individuals, but entire sectors of the population are permanently in a state of irregularity, are permanently in a state of migration even, where there is no, the progress narrative is completely disrupted here because there's no chance, there's no hope within the existing legal and political structures for these people, these bodies, these individuals to gain or attain that status of regularity or of being permanent or of having status. And the reason for that is, on the one level, can be discussed through looking at the technical elements of immigration and labor law, which I do in the book. But on another level, as you say, can only be explained by looking at that historical context and saying, actually, this is people who are following migrant routes that have been carved out since colonial empire, since colonial expansion. These are racialized bodies that are occupying places in society that are forever being seen as the sub-citizen or the classic kind of other. Or these are people who are working in labor sectors, in jobs, in like laboring in places that are never going to be recognized as of equal value to the kind of productive, public, marketized work. And so no matter what is happening here, it does have roots in the kind of racialized, capitalist and patriarchal system that has its roots in that historical context of 500 plus years ago. So those new normals are, yeah, both kind of big picture, how we've all adapted and we're all constantly adapting to live in this state of crisis, as well as being a new normal in terms of what is just in a way kind of accepted as being outside of the law slash a transgression of the law slash, like Judith Butler says, you know, the lives that are not worth living, those precarious lives that are just condemned to be in the gray space for forever.
Yeah, and Ryan, you brought it in this idea of modernity. Alan Pred, who is a geographer, talks about moving out not just of modernity or post-modernity, but hyper-modernity.
Mm.
What you're really describing, it's beyond postmodern. It's this bone grinding, this certain type of capitalism that's exploitative, that here you have again this process that it could only end up in this direction. And this is why before we go to the next question, I'd like to read a little bit from the book, just to kind of situate the conversation, so the audience can get a really good idea of how this book is written, and the multiple ideas that are feeding into it, and how it really does touch on the situation we are in right now with COVID. We're all kind of in this precarious margin area that refugees and people who are marginalized have been. We've all been shifted to this hyper modern margin. Let me go ahead and say. Ultimately, the success of neoliberalism lies in its ability to encompass and conform to human action, mobility, our dreams and aspirations, while concretely, materially undermining, disabling the fruitions. People on the ground live and work with the hope that their labor will help them achieve stability and security. Yet, the promise of citizenship, of making it, is directly contradicted by the pursuit of capital accumulation in a neoliberal system. So that you talk about ecotechnics, and it's central to your book. Could you explain that concept in relation to this passage?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So ecotechnics, I even feel like in what I've said to this point, it's time for ecotechnics, because we need to see where there's some space here outside of just this, as I say in kind of the introduction, this hurtling towards catastrophe, going from catastrophe to catastrophe. So before I define ecotechnics and explain the link to the passage, I just wanted to add one thing in terms of that passage with this idea of neoliberalism and the term neoliberalization, because I feel like that term can risk being something that is kind of also just hurled around, and we aren't quite able to actually pinpoint what we mean by that. So throughout my work, throughout the book, I try to make that link, as I think has come through in our conversation up to this point too, the link between neoliberalism and the process of neoliberalization, that is a term from Jamie Peck, the link between this process and the historical context of colonialism and capital accumulation. So neoliberalism and the process of neoliberalization is a process where the state is being redeployed for the purpose or for the goal of capital. And so it's a merging of this capital accumulation that we see as being, again, linked to capitalism, modes of production, and economic expansion, really, and exploitation with the state. So here we have the state playing a vital role, and with the state then comes the ideas of sovereignty and the prerogative over citizenship and deciding, who is worthy and who is not worthy as being recognized within the state system. So within this neoliberalization, and as that quote says, the dreams and aspirations that are what compel people to not only move and migrate, but also to continue working, to continue participating in the economic system. There is a sense that people do this not because we are robots, we are not just cogs in a machine, but there is something that we have that is life, that is, compelling us to keep participating, to keep moving, to keep laboring. And the problem then, on the one hand, is that this aspiration, these dreams, this promise of not only citizenship, but the promise of the economy, the promise of economic participation, is that at some point you will, we will make it. We will have this sense of having arrived, or, literally or figuratively. And as has been much written about, the problem, to put it mildly, with capitalist accumulation and with neoliberalization is that we never reach that point. There is a continuation of this constant lack of attainment, lack of arriving or making it. And this happens, I think, for the most privileged of society, as well as, on the scale, the least privileged, or the people who are the most exploited. So knowing this and kind of having this as something that is quite well documented and critiqued, I then use the concept or the diagnosis, actually, because if we dig a bit, it's not meant to be a concept that is applied, but it's more of a lens, a way of understanding our reality. So I use ecotechnics to grapple, or to try and grapple with this constant movement and this kind of mania that does make it seem as if we are all cogs in the capitalist machine. That is the techne, okay, the technologization that happens in the world that is mostly defined through capital accumulation. Ecotechnics, again, as a diagnosis, as an idea, suggests that we have the techne, the technics, but we also have the eco. The eco is then what happens, and again, as you said, and I'm really thankful that you said that this is grounded, so I'm not kind of drifting off into the clouds of La La Land here. The eco that happens is precisely these aspirations or these dreams, or this sense of being. And I'm saying that very consciously because these are terms that link back to Jean-Luc Nancy, who is the philosopher that I took this term ecotechnics from. But eco links us to this sense of being that actually is as real as the techne, capital accumulation, the technologization. But eco is always going to be separate from the techne, because they're two parts of, I don't know if I would say a whole, but they're two parts of ecotechnics. So on the one hand, we have the technologization that makes intelligible our being in the world. So the way that we relate, what we do. And in our current reality, or the reality for the past 500 years, that being in the world is most strongly understood and most obviously understood as capital-driven relationships, whether those are recognized or non-recognized, whether they're irregular, regular, whatever. But this is how we are all participating in this capitalist process, or even in this colonial matrix of power. But the eco is not something that is in competition with the techne, but rather it is happening at the same time. And it is parallel to almost the techne. And the eco is the sense, going to the origin of the term even eco, it is dwelling. It is literally how we be, how we are, what we are, without, what we are is even limiting that, without giving that eco a technical category, or without pinning it down, which is precisely what happens as soon as we say it out loud, or as soon as we do something. That technologization is inevitable. But ecotechnics as a lens, as a diagnosis, is what constantly, even in using it in the book, constantly kind of forced me to jolt out of falling into what I think is a dangerous mode of critique, or a dangerous mode of analysis even, whereby we write about these challenges, whether they're global or local, macro or micro, but we write about them as if the capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, as if all of those hegemonies were totalizing, and were the only thing that was happening. Because it can seem that way, absolutely, and I'm not denying that. And it's important to recognize just how interconnected and how powerful those hegemonic discourses and actual violences are. But they are not everything, because, and this is where in the book I go to looking at narratives of migrant journeys or narratives of people who work in precarious labor. And there's always the context, whether we call it the context or we call it the humanity, whatever we call it, the being, the life, there are always elements or there are always reasons why people continue to live, or why people continue to work, or why people continue to move. And those reasons, or that being, that relationality, is the eco. It's not something that can ever be technologized, because then we would be robots. We would completely just be capitalist machines. And that's actually never going to happen. Like, even though my students seem to think that AI is going to take over the world, but you know, like, there is something that I then try to draw out, or keep reminding myself, even as the author of this book, that if we were to shift our lens, if we were to shift our starting point, because all of us, you know, even by virtue of being here, all of us have our starting point within a Western epistemology, within that modernism or modernity's frame. And I'm not suggesting that we can get out of it. Okay, I'm not suggesting that we can just hop over to a different continent and somehow think differently. But if our questions, or the way that we address the challenges that we are then digging into in our research, if we look at not only what the historical context of colonialism, neoliberalism, capitalism, etc., has done, but also what is happening in those gray areas, in those spaces of permanent irregularity, or in even our own lives, the things that aren't captured, aren't concretized, to use another term, by capital accumulation, then, again, I use ecotechnics to suggest this, then perhaps we don't know how that would change our research or the outcome, but inevitably we would open onto different conversations. Because just by giving equal standing to the techne, we are recognizing that the techne is not total, and there is something else to be valued, even if that value just means giving it space within our conversations, within our discourse. Okay, I'll stop there because I know that you have another question.
Yeah, and the question really just follow up on that, because the book is it's a book of legal philosophy, and you bring the case law into it, from that perspective, but it's also very interdisciplinary, very multifaceted, and I think that the introducing this lens of ecotechnics, it allows you to discuss this relationality. Also going back to the last book talk of Julian Go, talking about um, how there's different relationships depending on where you are in the hierarchy. And so how does that lens allow you to discuss that, and also to bring it even more down to like street level, when you discuss it? How do these singulars exist within plurals, and how does that play out?
Yeah, thank you. So the singulars and the plural, that immediately is, again, from Jean-Luc Nancy. So I'll just explain that kind of very briefly, in the hope that that will help to kind of at least give an idea of what I'm doing with this. So the idea of being singular plural is that beings, and this is not limited to human beings. In fact, this isn't even limited to what is the word? Like animate beings. This can actually be a stone or a tree. Okay, so beings exist in the world. However, beings are singular in that they are contained. We are contained as a singularity that only knows itself, that only is singular because there is a plural. So you are not, or a stone is not, or a tree is not, a book is not singular without having a plural that reaffirms or that affirms, that creates that singularity. This is not the same as recognition. Okay, so this is not Levinas, because this is much more just at the very kind of basic ontological, what is being? We are beings that exist in a plurality. In a way, I say that, as if saying like it's obvious, because in some ways, and forgive me because I have been working on this for more than 10 years. So I don't mean to say like, oh, of course it's obvious. But even when I say this to my first year students or to people who make the mistake of asking me what I do and what my book is about, I have actually found that this idea of being singular plural is quite simple in some ways. It's quite basic. It's like, yeah, we exist because of a plurality. Okay, so if we kind of say, and whether or not you agree or not, but I say like, okay, so that's a starting point. So then what? What does this mean? Essentially what this means is that we are not, as beings, and then our plurality that we form, that multiple singularities form a plurality, that is our starting point. That is what we are. That's what's happening here in this world of living beings, in this world of plurals. If we start from there, then we have questions such as, what is the status of this person that just crossed a border? Or I'm working and what is the value of my work? We have these questions that can be answered or can be understood, can be sensed, can be part of that kind of eco in ways that are quite clear, I think, or simple. And again, this is not denying that you can't just walk out and say, I value you, so now you will not be exploited within the capitalist machine. But it's to say, we don't have to necessarily start from the mess, the incredible, violent, oppressive mess of the colonial matrix of power or the kind of legal modernity's ickiness, if I can just say that so unprofessionally. We can actually start from saying, what do we have? What's going on? What do we need? How do we relate? What is the relationship that is happening in a given space? And at the risk of sounding like that is entirely, idealistic, I early on actually in my writing, I remember thinking about how, and this was around Brexit, so with the referendum and then everything that was happening in the UK surrounding Brexit. And I was thinking about this, maybe it's common, maybe you've all heard this before, but this sense that even people who vote for the most restrictive, conservative immigration policies, anti-refugee, protect our borders kind of governments, we hear stories of people who have made those decisions as voters, but they say things like, oh, well, we have a family who arrived from Syria down the street and they're quite nice. We don't mind them. We like them. And it's always this kind of this dissonance of like, okay, but why then do you make these horrible decisions in your as a voter? And so there's so much noise. There's so much noise, so many reasons, so many complications of why on the political, legal, governance kind of performative level, there's such a challenge to this acceptance or this recognition of being singular plural. But on the level of who's your neighbor, or really like what's happening around you, there is a sense that there is more of a recognition of this being singular plural, and more of a recognition of, okay, what do we really need to survive, or what do we really need to live, or to live well even. COVID actually is probably, providing even more examples of this kind of recognition that then is at odds with electoral behavior, or is at odds with what people might publicly kind of say. And so Ecotechnics does not have an answer. At no point do I claim in the book that there is a solution, but recognizing that there is something going on in spite of, or at the same time as, this technologization and this hurtling towards, permanent normals of crises. This recognition that something else is going on has so much potential, has so much possibility, if we give it weight, if we give it space, if we give it time, if we actually think and start our thinking from that place. And so this is where I then draw on in the last chapter, I turn to some literature that's emerging from Global South, so de-coloniality and studies of pluriversality. So pluriversality as being the opposite in many ways of universality. So rather than the kind of legal modernity and Western epistemological drive towards singularities, towards holding on to a universal truth, or trying to find the answer or the solution or the very big band-aid or whatever it is, pluriversality says, okay, let's just see what we are. What stories do we have? What's happening? What do we really need? What do we really value? And it's plural because different places, different people, different communities, different locations, different places will have different ways to answer that question. But that's the point. That's ecotechnical. There's always going to be movement, and there's always going to be that difference. But let's make that the goal. Let's make that the space that we immerse ourselves in, rather than that space being constantly contained and framed and disciplined within legal modernity and the kind of capitalism.
Yeah, and that's a really good place to now invite an audience to have introduce their questions. Patricia has a follow-up question for you that she has typed into the chat box. And if you'd like to unmute yourself, we would love to hear your question.
Is that me?
Yes.
Yep. Yes, Anisa, can you hear me? Because I'm
now
getting
we can
a message.
hear you. Welcome. Yes.
Okay, right. So that was. I do apologise. Just at the crucial moment, my internet connection went. Anyway, hello, Anastasia. Lovely to see you. I just prefaced my comment first by saying that obviously I do know your research, but I haven't had the opportunity to read the book. So do take that into account in relation to my comment. So I'm really looking forward to reading it soon. And I guess my comment is not so much around the more transformative aspects of your thesis, but really on the question as to how we can talk, how the phenomena that you discuss leads us to think about legality, because even in your presentation, and with other researchers that are working sort of around the field, we find that the language of legality and illegality is in itself inadequate, just because of what's going on. So I was particularly struck by your comment about people who are in a permanent state of migration. And it occurred to me in that context, particularly in relation to Anisa's comment about the continuum, the colonial continuum, that what we see here has always been a relation between mobility and legality, with, if you like, putting it fairly crudely, three types of mobility. One, productive mobility, the sort of the kind of mobility that EU citizens have around Europe, the four freedoms, that's revered. And then you have a kind of nomadic mobility that tends to be, it's precarious, it's the condition of the refugee, for example. But then you have also the group, the individual that is seen to be too static, to not move at all. And I thought of this in the context particularly of the Windrush situation. Now, there was a lot going on in relation to the application of the hostile environment procedures that led to the situation of the Windrush descendants. But one very significant feature was that I think if possibly all of the individuals that were documented in the study that Amelia Gentleman produced had not left the UK since they had arrived. So they had not.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Patricia, but we have 1 minute.
Okay, so I do beg your pardon. So I hadn't, yeah, okay, so I hadn't even left to go on holiday. And that was part of the reason that they couldn't get the documentation that was needed. So I wonder if you could just say something about whether you see that, not partly you might say it's the new norm, but it definitely is a phenomenon that has always existed. If you're too immobile, the law makes you mobile in a most precarious way by rendering you illegal. So I do apologize for the length of that.
It's okay. I mean, it's a really important question. I want to give Anastasia time to answer it, but also understand people have to leave. So I do want to say thank everybody for joining us. If you have to leave, I will be sending you a follow-up email with a discount code provided by Anastasia's publisher. So if you would like to purchase the book, you have that incentive there. And if anybody wants to stay on, an extra 5-7 minutes, you're more than welcome, because I would like to have a response.
Can I just say too, actually, that if anyone needs to go, but if you have any questions, I'm completely, like, I would welcome you to email me. So feel free to email me. So Patricia, hi, it's so nice to see you. Thank you. Do you know, I think that's a really interesting point. And I have to admit that I hadn't thought about that in terms of, yeah, when I said the kind of permanent migration, but I would say that the even idea that the law, I try to not talk about the law as if there wasn't a person behind it, but that that Windrush scandal suggests that these people should have been ready to leave, that they should have been more mobile. That kind of on the opposite end still shows that there are certain bodies, certain demographics that are never seen as being allowed to stay or allowed to be at home somewhere, like the white British person in the Midlands who has never left their region. So yeah, that's interesting though. I hadn't thought about that connection directly, but that I will. Yeah.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. I just think too, sorry, just to add, but the incredible, and this is sort of stating the obvious, but the incredible arrogance of the law, and that idea that the law has to mandate or to suggest or to force this mobility is really, I think, highlighted in the example of the Windrush. But it's the same kind of arrogance that exists, even if you're dealing with someone who has just been in the country for a few weeks or a few months.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
I do just have one follow-up question about PhD students. You talked about in the very beginning about how it was difficult to publish a book like this, and we're hearing this over and over again from the authors that we've talked to. We're working in this interdisciplinary space. And then as a PhD student, I mean, you wouldn't even how did that play out when you started to think about writing this? Were you able to tease out any of these ideas, and were you encouraged to do that as a PhD student? Because that's really when you start to want to make these different connections, or did you have to wait?
Do you know, it's interesting because I think on the one hand, I could say that I had to wait, but I also think I needed to wait. So I don't think that I could have written what now is the book during my PhD because it needed time. It needed to really kind of sink in, and I needed to have the confidence to make these connections where they hadn't necessarily been made before in a kind of, you know, this is what I do sort of way. So it's kind of both, because within the structure of a PhD, I was very fortunate. I have to say that in my PhD environment with my just with the colleagues that I had around me, there was absolutely an encouragement to do things that were not just beholden to particular fields. Nevertheless, I have to say, and I'm not sure I'm there yet, but I have to be confident even now, 6 years after my Viva, I have to be confident to go with this, whether it's publishing or even conferences, because everyone at every point wants you to fit within, okay, will you do migration then? I'm like, well, yes, but, well, then you do critical legal theory. Well, you know, and then like labor law, I'm like, well, but I also, so it's always uncomfortable, and that continues. So I would say, yeah, it's much more difficult as a PhD student, not impossible, but maybe the thing is just to be confident to do it, and to know that not fitting somewhere perfectly is okay. But yeah, there's going to be resistance, whether it's PhD supervisors. I'm not going to bore everyone, but my Viva itself and the examiners, even in that level, I came across challenges because it didn't fit. This is neither a purely legal philosophical project, neither is it socio-legal. So there's another tension that, and I'm not blaming anyone, but you know, people want to say, okay, well, this is socio-legal, so then there is qualitative aspects, and why didn't you do interviews? Or if this is legal philosophy, why didn't you then do a whole chapter just on Jean-Luc Nancy? Yeah, so it's a challenge, but I think it's the only, at least for me, I've decided that it's the only way that I can be excited and happy about my work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us today, and be looking for that email with the discount code. And I hope you purchase this book and read it. It was really wonderful to read. Pleasure to read. And thank you, Anastasia. This has been a really wonderful discussion.
Questions.
And we'll see you all in September or August when we start, but we might have another book talk coming up about animal law.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It's great to see everyone. Thank you. And those of you that I haven't met too, I hope I meet you someday.